trapped in a loveless marriage for 7 years, until the Duke discovered why she prayed for him. The chapel was cold, as it had been every winter morning for the past 7 years. Evangeline knelt upon the stone flags, her prayer book clasped against her sternum, a habit so ingrained that her fingers had worn the leather smooth at its spine. The single taper candle she had lit burned steadily in its brass holder, casting shadows that moved across the small altar as though the walls themselves were breathing in sympathy with her unspoken petitions. Outside, the Ashford estate lay wrapped in December frost. Snow had fallen overnight, thick and muffling, blanketing the rooftops and garden walls in merciful silence. Somewhere in the manor, servants moved through their duties with practiced quietness. The household had learned over these 7 winters not to disturb the Duchess when she knelt in the chapel. It was understood without remark, a courtesy extended to solitude, the way one steps softly past a sick-room door. But solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. Solitude is chosen, loneliness is endured. Evangeline's hazel eyes remained fixed upon the small wooden crucifix above the altar, though what she saw was not the figure carved there, but rather the absence of something she could not name. Her chestnut hair, bound in its practical chignon, was properly arranged. Her merino wool dress, dyed the color of moss, draped correctly across her lap. Even her hands folded upon the prayer book bore the discipline of years, not trembling, not clutching, simply folded as a duchess's hands ought to be. "Forgive him," she whispered, the words so low they scarcely disturbed the chapel's silence. "Give him peace where I cannot. Spare him the weight of his own conscience, and if it is pride to pray for his redemption rather than for my own comfort, then let that pride be counted against me, not against him." The candle flame bent slightly, as though touched by an invisible hand. Evangeline watched it without moving. She had never demanded comfort from heaven, only that her husband be spared the particular torture of a conscience that believed itself unworthy. That was a prayer she could make without scandal, without pretense, without the indignity of begging for warmth from a man who had decided, long before their marriage was consecrated, that warmth was a dangerous thing. The sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond the chapel broke the spell. Evangeline did not flinch. She had grown accustomed to the sensation of being observed, whilst believing herself unwatched. The household staff passed regularly. The Dowager Duchess made occasional inspections. Visiting relatives peered at her with expressions that mingled pity and judgment, but she remained still, unmoved, until the footsteps receded. It was then, in the restored silence, that she allowed herself a single gesture of grief. She pressed the edge of her prayer book more firmly against her heart, as though to contain something that might otherwise escape, a hope she dared not voice, a longing she could only confess to God and the burning wick of a single candle. The chapel clock, small and austere, marked the quarter hour. Evangeline rose with deliberate grace, straightened her skirts, and extinguished the candle with a careful breath. The smoke curled upward and dissolved into the cold air. She left the chapel as she had entered it, quietly, without looking back, and made her way through the manor's dim corridors toward the breakfast room, where social duty awaited, along with the Dowager Duchess's scrutiny and a breakfast plate she would eat with the appearance of appetite she did not possess. Behind her the chapel remained empty and cold. The brass candle holder caught the pale morning light and reflected it back toward the altar in a small, persistent gleam. By mid-morning, the Ashford estate had settled into the particular rhythm of a great house in its winter preparations. Decorations for Christmas were being arranged, garlands of holly and ivy bound with dark green velvet, candles being set into holders throughout the public rooms, the drawing room already beginning to smell of pine and beeswax. The season of mercy and miracles, as the vicar would inevitably preach, was upon them. The tenants expected generosity from their duke, the parish expected visible piety, the Dowager Duchess expected that her son's marriage would, at the very least, present the appearance of Christian contentment. It was in the estate office that the morning's first test arrived. Clara Wren, the schoolmistress who oversaw the village charity and organized the Ashford Christmas relief, had come with her leather-bound ledger and her careful lists. She was a woman of middle years, whose practical competence had made her indispensable to anyone with a conscience, which limited her circle to the servants and, increasingly, the Duchess herself. "The accounts are in order, Your Grace," Clara said, laying the ledger open before Evangeline. Her ink-stained fingers traced the columns of names and amounts with precision. "But I confess, I am troubled. The allocation for the schoolhouse repairs, it is adequate, certainly, But the families in the North Cottage required extra blankets this year. 2 of the children are consumptive. Evangeline leaned forward, studying the neat handwriting with the concentration of one trained to listen without seeming to judge. Her own hand, when she pointed to a particular entry, was steady. "The allowance for parish fuel," she said quietly. "We can reduce it by 1/4 and apply the difference to both the schoolhouse and the cottage families. The Dowager Duchess will not question a modest decrease in the general account if it remains within the larger charitable framework." Clara's expression shifted, not gratefully, but with something more akin to recognition. She had long ago ceased to be surprised by the Duchess's practical mercy, her ability to navigate the complicated mathematics of aristocratic duty without permitting sentiment to cloud judgment. "His Grace has not approved such adjustments without consultation," Clara observed, not accusingly but as a matter of fact. "His Grace," Evangeline replied, her tone remaining level, "has entrusted the Christmas relief to my management these 3 years. I believe he has made his will clear through absence of objection." She paused, then added, with the faintest diminishment of her careful reserve, "Besides, Clara, we are approaching the season when even the hardest hearts are expected to remember that Christ was born into poverty. I merely propose to honor that memory with something more than ceremony." It was then that the drawing-room bell rang, the signal that the Dowager Duchess was ready for her morning meeting with the household. Such summonses were never casual. They were imperatives dressed in courtesy. Evangeline set down her pen with deliberate care and rose. "I shall settle this with Her Grace," she said, though her eyes flickered, just once, just long enough for Clara to see, with something that might have been resignation or might have been the smallest flare of determined courage. "Do not concern yourself with further complications. The children will have their blankets." She left Clara in the office with the ledger still open, the entries still waiting for approval, and made her way through the manor's formal corridors toward the Dowager's sitting room. As she walked, her gloved hand, the left one, which bore the signet ring of her title and nothing else, smoothed the fine kid leather at the seam where emotion might otherwise betray itself. The Dowager Duchess was seated by the window, her spine as rigid as iron, her black silk dress somehow darkening the light around her. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of making virtue look like intimidation. "I have been informed," the Dowager said before Evangeline had fully entered the room, "that you have been making adjustments to the Christmas relief without consulting your husband. This is precisely the sort of independent action that encourages servants to gossip and undermines the Duke's authority." Evangeline had learned over 7 years that the only defense against such accusations was to offer no defense at all. "I believe His Grace wishes the relief to be adequate to the season's needs," she replied calmly. "The adjustments I have made are modest, and the overall expenditure remains within the approved amount." "Your belief," the Dowager Duchess said, "is not a substitute for proper deference. You are the Duke's wife, not his conscience." The word conscience was pronounced with particular venom, as though it were an affliction. "Your position grants you certain privileges, certainly, but it does not grant you the authority to act as though you alone understand what is right." The words hung in the cold air between them. Evangeline felt them land, felt them settle into the space where so many other such judgments had accumulated over the years, building like frost upon a window. But she did not flinch. Instead, she folded her hands before her and spoke with the kind of quiet that sometimes carries more authority than argument. "Madam," she said, "I have never presumed to understand what is right beyond the scope of my duty, but I do understand hunger and cold, and the particular helplessness of a child who cannot comprehend why warmth has been denied her. If that understanding has overstepped the boundaries of my station, I ask your pardon. But I cannot ask pardon for the charity itself." The Dowager Duchess's eyes narrowed. For a moment the drawing-room seemed to contract around them both, the space between mistress and daughter-in-law becoming charged with something more complex than simple power. Then, with calculated dismissiveness, the Dowager turned her face back toward the window. "You may go," she said, "but I shall inform my son of your actions. It is his decision whether such independence is to be tolerated." As Evangeline turned to leave, she allowed herself the smallest nod, not of submission but of completion. The morning had demanded what it demanded. She had answered as she was able. The rest lay beyond her authority, in the hands of a man who had learned over 7 years to treat his own wife as though she were a pleasant necessity with whom he shared a title, but nothing more. Nicholas Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had not slept properly in 6 years. It was a private fact he shared with no one, not even the valet who prepared his morning ablutions with mechanical precision. Sleep, he had discovered, required a lightness of conscience that he had forfeited long ago. Instead, he occupied the hours between sunset and dawn with correspondence, accounts, the management of estates, and the quiet anguish of a man who had trained himself to believe that isolation was the same thing as integrity. It was in his study, late on that same December morning, that a folded piece of parish correspondence arrived on his desk, placed there with a discretion that suggested guilt on the part of whoever had delivered it. It was the expense accounting from the relief distribution, unremarkable, except for the note at the bottom, penned in his wife's hand, adjustments made in accordance with charitable necessity and the spirit of the season. He held the paper for a long moment without reading further, simply feeling the weight of it, the careful precision of her handwriting. Evangeline's letters were always this way, economical, precise, entirely devoid of sentiment or demands. She wrote as though communication were an administrative function rather than an intimacy, and perhaps that was what it was. Perhaps that was what they both required from their marriage, the pretense that it was a business arrangement and nothing more complicated. His mother's voice, when she appeared in his study 20 minutes later without knocking, carried the particular shrillness of injustice nursing itself. "She has acted without your sanction again." Charity accounts adjusted according to her own philosophy. "It is becoming intolerable, Nicholas. Your wife conducts herself as though she were consulting with divine revelation rather than her husband's expressed wishes." The Duke did not look up from his desk. His fingers, when he raised them, moved toward the pocket watch with its practiced restraint. The mechanism inside ticked steadily, faithful, predictable, mercifully incapable of surprise or disappointment. "My wife," he said, with the flat tone of a man reciting something he has been forced to memorize, "has been given authority over the Christmas relief for 3 years without objection. If the accounts are in order, as the ledgers suggest, I see no cause for intervention." "You never see cause for intervention where she is concerned," his mother replied bitterly. "It is as though you have surrendered your responsibilities the moment we returned from the wedding journey. Do you understand what that appears like to the household, to the parish? A wife who acts without her husband's counsel can only be pitied or condemned, and pity, Nicholas, is infinitely worse than scandal." He opened the watch. The hands stood at 11:30. 7 years, he thought distantly. 7 years of marriage maintained with perfect propriety, perfect distance, perfect failure. 7 years of watching his wife move through the house like a ghost who had learned to perform the rituals of existence without actually occupying space. 7 years of knowing, with absolute certainty, that he did not deserve her courtesy. "You may leave," he said to his mother, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could not be questioned, even as it trembled almost imperceptibly with something that might have been rage or might have been pain. "And in future, such household matters are to be resolved between myself and the Duchess. She has my confidence." It was a lie. He had never given his wife anything, not confidence, not warmth, not the basic recognition that 7 years of silent devotion might merit something more than polite distance, but it was the only defense he could offer, without confessing the true reason for his coldness, that he believed himself unworthy of the kindness she so carefully extended, and that warmth, when it came, would feel like a mercy he had no right to accept. When his mother had departed, stiffly with offended pride marking every step, Nicholas returned to his desk and picked up the parish correspondence once more. He read his wife's note again. "Adjustments made in accordance with charitable necessity and the spirit of the season." The spirit of the season. As though she believed Christmas could penetrate the frost that had accumulated between them, as though mercy were possible, redemption achievable, in a marriage that had become a beautiful, perfectly executed pantomime of conjugal duty. He set the letter down and returned to his accounts, forcing his attention back to the columns of figures, the margins of profit and loss, the quantifiable evidence that some things, at least, could be measured and controlled. But his fingers, when he reached for his pen, were not quite steady. And in the depths of the study, where the winter light fell in thin, cold rays across the furniture, something that might have been hope, or its cruel imitation, flickered and held its breath. The Christmas gathering had begun in earnest by the following afternoon, the manor filled with relatives and neighboring gentry, their carriages arriving at regular intervals through the snow, their servants managing the complicated logistics of seasonal visitation. The Dowager Duchess had arranged everything with her customary efficiency. Guest rooms prepared, menus approved, social hierarchies adjusted to accommodate rank and precedence. It was a performance of seasonal hospitality executed with all the warmth of a military campaign. Evangeline moved through the arrangements as she had moved through 7 years of such occasions, present without being prominent, helpful without demanding recognition, visible only insofar as her absence would be marked as negligence. She ensured that the guest chambers were properly aired, that the drawing-room flowers were arranged with appropriate formality, that the tables bore the correct placement of rank. By evening, she was exhausted in the particular way that comes from holding oneself in perfect posture for hours whilst managing the invisible labor of hospitality. It was Clara who found her near dusk, in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own. Not by right, but by the simple fact that no one else seemed to want it. The room faced the chapel garden, and from its window one could see the path that led toward the estate's quieter precincts. "You are pale," Clara observed without preamble. It was the privilege of long service and genuine affection that she could say such things. "And you have not eaten since morning." "I watched the breakfast table. Hospitality requires that one's own comfort be tertiary at best," Evangeline replied, though she made no effort to deny the accusation. Her gloved hand was smoothing the seam of her left glove, that particular gesture that had become as inevitable as breath. The guests must be satisfied, the household must function, and the Dowager Duchess's expectations must be exceeded. My own state is irrelevant. Clara set down a small tray she had been carrying, bread, cheese, and a cup of tea that still steamed faintly in the growing twilight. "It is not irrelevant," she said firmly, "and it will not go unnoticed eventually. Devotion taken to the point of erasure begins to look like something else entirely. Despair, perhaps, or a form of quiet rebellion that society will find it necessary to punish." The words struck something undefended in Evangeline's composure. She turned away from the window and accepted the chair Clara had indicated, though she made no immediate move to eat. Instead, she simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the food as though it were an artifact from a world she no longer inhabited. "Do you know why I pray, Clara?" she asked softly. "Not as a duchess, not as a woman fulfilling social obligation, but truly, do you know?" Clara settled herself in the opposite chair with the practicality of one accustomed to difficult conversations. "I have observed," she said carefully, "that you pray with an intensity that suggests petition rather than mere thanksgiving. Pray tell me, then, what petition drives you to the chapel every morning before dawn?" Evangeline was silent for a long moment. Outside the window, the snow had begun to fall again, thick flakes moving slowly through the grey air, like thoughts too heavy to hold themselves aloft. When she finally spoke, her voice had become something thinner, more fragile, as though she were admitting to a transgression rather than describing a practice. "I pray for his peace," she said. "Not for the marriage, not for warmth between us, or affection, or any of the things that a wife might reasonably petition heaven to provide. I pray for him, for his conscience, which I have come to believe is a burden he carries with a weight that makes love seem like an impossible luxury. I pray that he be spared from the particular torture of believing himself unworthy of gentleness. That is what I ask of God every morning in a cold chapel before the household wakes." Clara's expression underwent a subtle transformation, not shock, but a deepening of understanding, the recognition of something she had suspected but never named. "You love him," she said. It was not a question. "I love what he could be," Evangeline corrected gently. "I love the man who exists beneath the Duke, the one who makes careful calculations about relief funds, and who does not sleep properly because his conscience will not permit rest. I love him in the only way I am permitted to love him, through prayer, through service, through the daily choice to remain kind in the face of his studied distance. It is not the love that the poets celebrate, but it is love nonetheless. It is simply a love that has learned to content itself with being unseen." It was at that precise moment, the moment of confession, the moment when Evangeline's guard had dropped just enough to allow truth to emerge, that the chapel clock struck the hour, and from somewhere in the manor came the sound of the Duke's voice, speaking to one of the arriving guests in the entrance hall. The sound was distant, formal, carrying the peculiar flatness it always held when he spoke to anyone other than his mother or the household staff. Clara rose quietly, gathering the untouched tray, with the understanding that appetite would not return this evening. But before she departed, she leaned down and pressed a hand briefly to Evangeline's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of witness, of the particular solace that comes from being truly known by another soul. "Such love," Clara said quietly, "is never truly unseen. The heavens see it, and sooner or later, I suspect, so shall he." The evening progressed with the inevitable stiffness of a formal dinner, attended by those who understood their roles perfectly, but harbored little warmth toward one another. The long table gleamed beneath candlelight, the silver and glass arranged with mathematical precision. The Dowager Duchess presided at one end, her black silk seeming to absorb rather than reflect the light. The Duke sat at the opposite end, his manner courteous and distant, the manner of a man attending to duty rather than entertainment. Evangeline occupied her appointed place midway down the table, with the requisite mixture of attention and invisibility that her station demanded. She smiled appropriately at her neighbor's remarks, ensured that conversation continued with gentle questions, and managed the intricate choreography of courses and service with the ease of long practice. No one observing her would have suspected that she had spent the previous hour in confession, or that her heart was engaged in the particular anguish of loving someone who seemed determined not to be loved. It was during the second course that something shifted. The Duke, in conversation with a visiting baronet regarding estate management, made a remark about the Christmas relief distribution. "My wife," he said, his voice carrying just enough formality to suggest both distance and something else, perhaps defensiveness, perhaps a declaration, "has a gift for understanding what the season demands of us. Where I see only accounts, she sees human necessity. I have learned to trust her judgment in such matters." The words were brief, hardly remarkable, but they hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed, to Evangeline's heightened awareness, to touch everyone at the table. The Dowager Duchess's expression became carefully neutral. Several guests shifted slightly in their seats, and the Duke, having made his statement, returned his attention to his plate with the air of a man who had discharged a debt and would not speak of it again. After dinner, whilst the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Evangeline found herself once more managing the evening's arrangements, ensuring the fire was properly tended, that tea was prepared to the Dowager's exact specifications, that the visiting ladies were provided with suitable conversation topics. It was near 11 o'clock before she could finally excuse herself, citing fatigue, and make her way toward her own chambers. The manor was quiet at that hour, the servants having retired to their quarters, most of the household settled for the night. Evangeline moved through the corridors with the careful quietness of one accustomed to moving through space without disturbing it. But as she passed the chapel entrance, she paused. The chapel door was slightly ajar, and from within, visible only because the moon had emerged from behind the clouds and was shining through the stained glass window, came a pale, silvered light. More significantly, and this stopped her breath entirely, she could see a figure kneeling before the altar. A tall figure, broad-shouldered, unmistakably male. For a moment, Evangeline did not move. She could not move. The sight of her husband in the chapel, in the place she had claimed as her own for 7 years, doing the very thing she had kept as her private devotion, seemed to reorder something fundamental in the architecture of their marriage. But then, with careful deliberation, she backed away from the door. This was a private moment, not meant for her observation. If the Duke had chosen to pray, that choice was his own, his sanctuary separate from hers. She would not violate that boundary by witnessing what he might have come to heaven to confess. She continued toward her chambers, but her step was lighter than it had been, and her hand, when she reached the small icon she kept in her sitting room, trembled slightly. For the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps in some small measure her prayers had been heard. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a crystalline brightness that comes only after heavy snow. The world beyond the manor windows had been transformed into something almost unbearably beautiful, every surface edged with white, every branch laden with ice that caught the pale December sunlight and transformed it into something that resembled grace. It was the kind of morning that made one believe, however briefly, that miracles were not merely the province of theology, but of meteorology as well. Evangeline had not slept. She had spent the night in a state between restlessness and prayer, her mind occupied with the image of the Duke in the chapel, his tall figure silhouetted against the altar's meager light. She had not mentioned the incident to anyone, not even to Clara, though Clara's presence at breakfast had seemed to suggest that she sensed something altered in her friend's demeanor. It was mid-morning when a message came from the Duke's study, requesting her presence. Such requests were not uncommon. There were always household matters requiring her input, charitable distributions to be approved, menus to be discussed. But this message carried an unusual phrasing. At your earliest convenience and in private. Evangeline ascended the stairs toward the study with a composure that masked the small but insistent trembling of her pulse. The door was closed, as it always was, but when she knocked and received permission to enter, she found the Duke not at his desk, but rather standing by the window, looking out onto the snow-covered gardens. He did not turn immediately. When he did, his grey-blue eyes seemed different, less guarded than usual, but also more troubled, as though some interior struggle had worn through the careful restraint he ordinarily maintained. "I came to the chapel last night," he said without preamble. His voice was hoarse, as though the words had been difficult to produce. "I have not been to the chapel in—" He paused, his hand moving toward his pocket watch, before he seemed to arrest the gesture. "In many years. I came because I could no longer avoid it, because the weight of avoidance had become heavier than the weight of confession." Evangeline said nothing. She stood near the door, her hands clasped before her, waiting. "I found evidence of your presence there," he continued. A candle burned down to its final inches, wax fallen like— He stopped himself, seeming to find the metaphor too revealing. "I understood, standing in that chapel, that you have been praying. For years you have been kneeling in that cold space and praying, whilst I have been here in this study, pretending that distance could serve as virtue." His eyes met hers directly, and what she saw there was not the distant courtesy of 7 years, but something rawer, more vulnerable, the expression of a man confronting truths he had spent years avoiding. "I wish to know," he said, and now his voice dropped lower, becoming almost tender, "what it is you pray for. Not as your husband necessarily, though God knows I am that, simply as a man who has spent 7 years in darkness and has only now begun to suspect that the light has been there all along, kneeling in a chapel, burning patiently in the form of a single candle, and a heart that persevered when it had every right to break." Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, patient and relentless, transforming everything it touched. Evangeline's breath caught, and for a moment she was unable to find the composition that had sustained her through 7 years of careful distance. The Duke had spoken plainly, not with the formal courtesy of the drawing-room, but with something far more dangerous— honesty. And honesty, she had come to understand, was a form of intimacy that distance could not protect against. "I do not pray for the marriage," she said, and her voice was steady, though her hands had begun to tremble slightly. She clasped them more firmly, maintaining the discipline of her posture, even as something within her began to crack open like winter ice under the weight of spring. "I pray for you, Your Grace. I have prayed every morning for 7 years, for your peace, for the forgiveness of a conscience that I suspect has become your harshest judge." The Duke moved closer, not aggressively, but with the careful deliberation of one approaching something fragile that might shatter if handled carelessly. "How do you know," he asked quietly, "that my conscience requires forgiveness? What could you possibly know of the weight I carry?" "I know," Evangeline replied, "because you have worn your guilt as plainly as you wear your coat. It is visible in the way you avoid the chapel, in the way you check your pocket watch as though time itself were an accusation, in the way you have kept distance between us, as though proximity were a form of contamination. I know because a woman who observes carefully learns to read the language that a man's silence speaks." She took a breath, a visible breath, one that seemed to cost her something, and continued. "You were not always this way. The servants speak of you when they believe I am not listening. They remember a duke who was capable of laughter, of warmth, of the kind of gentleness that suggests a heart not yet hardened. Something happened. Some accident of conscience, some failure you believe yourself responsible for, and instead of seeking redemption, you chose isolation, as though suffering could serve as payment for whatever debt you imagine you owe." The Duke's hand moved toward his watch again, but this time he stopped himself entirely, letting his arm drop. When he spoke, his voice had become something barely more than a whisper. "A tenant's child," he said. 7 years ago, during the winter floods, I had decided, against the steward's advice, that the drainage system did not require repair. I chose profit over caution. There was a little girl, she could not have been more than 4 years old, caught in the water when the stream overflowed its banks. She died before the physicians could reach her. The confession hung in the air between them, and Evangeline felt it strike her like a physical blow. She understood in that moment precisely what burden he had been carrying, precisely why warmth had seemed to him like a betrayal of the child he had failed to protect. "And you have been punishing yourself," she said softly, "ever since." You have believed that to permit yourself happiness, comfort, or the softness of genuine affection would be to dishonor that child's memory, to suggest that her death could be balanced against your own contentment. "Is that not what I deserve?" he asked, and the words were raw, breaking open in a way that suggested he had never spoken them aloud before. "Is it not fitting that I should live with constant reminder of my failure, that I should deny myself the comforts that others take for granted?" Evangeline moved toward him then, slowly, with the care of one approaching something wounded. When she spoke, her voice carried a tenderness that she had not permitted herself to express in 7 years. "What you deserve," she said, "is what every soul deserves: the possibility of redemption, the chance to atone not through endless punishment, but through the deliberate choice to be better, to do better, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You have the power to ensure that no other child suffers, as that girl suffered. You have the authority to mandate the repairs your steward recommended, to oversee safety measures across all your estates, to use your position not as a means of profit, but as a trust. That is how you honor her memory, not through suffering, but through the grace of choosing mercy." She reached out very slowly and took his hand. Her gloved fingers against his were steady, purposeful, not a gesture of comfort given from pity, but an act of solidarity, of recognition. "And you honor it," she continued, "by allowing yourself to be loved, by accepting that grace is not something that must be earned through suffering, but is offered freely by those who see your soul and find it worthy. I have been praying every morning, not that you would suffer less, but that you would finally understand that your suffering does not balance the scales of justice. Only redemption can do that, only the choice to live differently." The Duke's fingers tightened around hers, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I do not know how to be other than what I have become." "Then," Evangeline replied, "we shall learn it together. But we cannot learn it in silence or in the distance that has held us apart. We cannot learn it whilst the chapel remains a place you fear to enter. Christmas comes tomorrow, the season when the world celebrates the possibility of redemption, granted not to the worthy, but to those most in need of grace. Perhaps we should begin there." Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crystalline perfection that seemed almost scripted by Providence itself. The snow had ceased and the world had transformed into something luminous, every surface gleaming beneath the weak but persistent winter sun. Within the manor, the servants had labored through the night to arrange the final preparations. Garlands of holly and ivy adorned every doorway and mantelpiece. Candles had been lit in every room. The great drawing room smelled of pine and cinnamon and the particular fragrance of seasonal hope. Evangeline had not slept. She had spent the hours after her encounter with the Duke in a state between wonder and careful caution, afraid to allow hope to fully take root, lest it be suddenly, cruelly withdrawn. But as morning broke and she dressed in a gown of deep green silk, the color of growth, of promise, she found herself moving with a lightness that had been absent for years. The household gathered for breakfast in a state of heightened anticipation. The Dowager Duchess presided with her customary severity, though even her rigid composure seemed to have softened slightly in the face of the season's demands. The visiting guests chattered with the mixture of genuine cheer and strategic social calculation that characterized such gatherings. Clara sat with the schoolchildren, who had been invited to the manor for the morning's distribution of gifts and charitable offerings. It was when the Duke entered the breakfast room that Evangeline felt the world seem to pause and reset itself. He was dressed in dark coat and waistcoat, the oxblood scarf visible at his neck, his bearing as composed as always, but his eyes, his grey-blue eyes that had been dulled for 7 years with the weight of guilt, seemed different. They seemed almost clear, as though some weight had been set down, at least temporarily. He greeted the assembled company with appropriate courtesy, took his seat at the head of the table, and proceeded with breakfast as though it were an ordinary morning. But when his gaze found Evangeline's across the table, held for just a moment longer than social propriety strictly demanded, she felt her heart achieve a kind of stillness that suggested something fundamental had shifted. After breakfast, as the guests dispersed toward the drawing room to prepare for the morning's charitable distribution, the Duke requested that Evangeline accompany him on a brief inspection of the chapel. It was an excuse, transparent and deliberate, and the Dowager Duchess's expression suggested that she recognized it as such, but she said nothing, confined to silence by the social necessity of not objecting to a duke's wishes regarding his own wife. The chapel was cold, as it always was, but it was also prepared for the day's services. Evergreen garlands adorned the altar, and the brass candle holder, the one that had witnessed Evangeline's 7 years of devotion, held a fresh taper, prepared but not yet lit. "I have been here this morning," the Duke said quietly, "before the household woke. I have not been inside this chapel since my appointment to the dukedom, before the child died, before I allowed guilt to construct walls between myself and everything approaching warmth. I came this morning to understand something, to comprehend why you would spend 7 years on her behalf, praying for a man who had given you nothing but distance in return." He moved toward the altar and stood before the simple crucifix, his hands clasped before him in an approximation of prayer, though his eyes remained open, fixed on the wooden figure above him. "Standing here," he continued, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone confessing to divine witness rather than human ears, "I began to understand that your prayers were never truly for me. They were for her, for the child who died because of my negligence. You were praying for her soul, for her memory, for the possibility that her brief life might matter to someone beyond her grieving parents. And in doing so, you were teaching me, through the example of your devotion, that suffering can be transformed into mercy, that loss can become purpose." He turned to face Evangeline, who had remained near the chapel entrance, witness to his confession. "I cannot undo the past. I cannot restore that child to life, cannot take back the choice that cost her everything. But I can ensure that her death is not merely a tragedy to be endured, it can become a catalyst for change. The drainage system across all my estates will be repaired and maintained. I have already sent word this morning, and each winter on the anniversary of her death, I will establish a fund in her name for the relief of families in distress." He extended his hand toward Evangeline, not the formal hand of a duke greeting his Duchess in public, but an intimate gesture, palm upward, inviting her to step closer. "What I cannot do alone," he said, "is bear the weight of redemption. I require someone to remind me that grace is not merely a theological concept, but a lived practice, someone who understands that forgiveness is not something we grant to ourselves, but something we receive and allow others to receive. Will you teach me, Evangeline? Will you permit me to learn from your example how to transform suffering into purpose?" Evangeline moved toward him, her steps measured but increasingly certain. When she placed her hand in his, she felt the tremor that ran through him. A man unaccustomed to gentleness, encountering it for perhaps the first time in years, her gloved fingers were steady against his, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 7 years of faithful waiting made manifest. "I have been teaching you all along," she said softly. "I have been teaching you through prayer, through service, through the stubborn refusal to accept that you were beyond redemption. You are only now beginning to listen. But yes, your grace, yes, I will stand beside you. Not as a duchess standing beside a duke, but as a woman standing beside a man who has finally allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to receive grace." The Christmas service that afternoon was observed with all the ceremony and formality that the season demanded. The local parish church, bedecked with holiday decorations and filled to capacity with the Duke's tenants and the surrounding gentry, provided the backdrop for a liturgy that had been repeated without significant alteration for centuries. The vicar intoned the traditional prayers, the organ, a magnificent instrument funded by the Ashford estate, provided the music, and the congregation moved through the ritual with the reverence that custom required. But something within the church had changed, though only those perceptive enough to notice subtlety would have recognized it. The Duke, seated in the family pew with the Dowager Duchess on his left, had permitted his wife to occupy the space directly to his right, a positioning that broke with 7 years of established protocol, and more significantly, at one point during the reading of the Gospel, his hand had found hers in the narrow space between them, fingers meeting briefly, a gesture so subtle that none but the most observant would have witnessed it. Evangeline sat motionless, barely allowing herself to breathe, aware that this small touch represented a seismic shift in the architecture of their marriage. 7 years of careful distance had been interrupted by the briefest of contacts, and she felt it reverberate through her entire being like a bell struck at midnight. After the service, as the congregation dispersed into the cold afternoon and the gentry returned to their carriages, the Duke remained behind in the church with Evangeline, whilst the rest of the household made their way back to the manor. Clara, understanding with her peculiar sensitivity that something significant was transpiring, had taken it upon herself to occupy the Dowager Duchess with detailed accounts of the charity school's progress, thereby providing a buffer of time and distance. In the shadowed quiet of the empty church, with only the grey winter light filtering through the stained glass windows, the Duke drew Evangeline toward the small alcove where the memorial plaques for the estate's honoured dead were mounted. "I came here this morning," he said, "before the service, and I caused to be added a plaque. It is not yet installed, but it will be. It reads, 'In memory of Eleanor Ashford, aged 4 years, whose brief life taught her father that mercy must precede judgment, and that redemption lies not in endless suffering, but in the determination to do better. May her example guide all who enter here.'" Evangeline felt tears begin to form, but she held them in check through sheer force of will. The naming of the child, the giving of the child a formal identity beyond the tragedy of her death, seemed to Evangeline to represent a kind of transformation, a movement from endless guilt toward bounded, purposeful remembrance. "You have given her a name," Evangeline whispered. "Before you could not speak of her without the weight of accusation. Now you name her Eleanor. It is beautiful." "It is what you have been teaching me," the Duke replied. "That to remember is not to condemn oneself endlessly, but to honor. That love can persist beyond death, and that we are not required to suffer in perpetuity to prove our worthiness. You have been teaching me grace through your own example, though I was too blind to see it." He lifted her gloved hand and brought it to his lips, a gesture so formally romantic, so entirely absent from their 7 years of marriage, that it seemed almost to require translation from a language they had not previously spoken. "I do not know," he continued, his voice low and carrying the weight of genuine uncertainty, "how to undo 7 years of distance. I do not know if you are capable of forgiveness for the coldness I have maintained, for the way I have made you small and invisible in your own marriage. But I am asking, here in this church where I have just promised to begin again, I am asking if you will permit me to try, to attempt perhaps imperfectly and with frequent failure, to become the husband you deserve." Evangeline looked at him, truly looked at him, without the careful guarding that had characterized her observation for 7 years. She saw in his face the remnants of the man he had been before guilt had calcified his heart, and she saw, too, the possibility of the man he might yet become. "Yes," she said simply, and then, because the chapel seemed to permit a honesty that the manor's formal rooms did not, "Yes, Your Grace. Yes, Nicholas. I will stand beside you. I will teach you if I am able, and I will begin to allow myself to believe that perhaps my prayers have been heard after all." The Duke drew her close, not in the formal manner of public display, but in the intimate warmth of genuine human connection. His hand, when it moved to her cheek, was gentle, tentative, as though he were afraid that she might dissolve if he held her too firmly. And in that moment, in the shadowed quiet of the church, with only the light of faith to illuminate them, 7 years of silent longing found its first genuine expression. The return to the manor was conducted with all the ceremonial formality that the occasion demanded, yet something within the household seemed to have subtly transformed. The Dowager Duchess, upon observing her son and daughter-in-law arrive together in the same carriage, a breach of 7 years' established custom, narrowed her eyes with an expression that mingled suspicion and calculation. But she remained silent, confined to observation by the simple fact that the Duke, for the first time in memory, had demonstrated an unmistakable preference for his wife's company over maternal obligation. The afternoon unfolded with the distribution of Christmas gifts to the estate's servants and tenants. The ceremony, which had been conducted in previous years with the Duchess present but peripheral, took on a different character entirely. The Duke worked in deliberate partnership with Evangeline, their collaboration creating a visible unity that the household could not fail to register. When families arrived to receive their allotments, blankets, food parcels, small gifts for children, they witnessed something they had not seen before. The Duke, speaking with genuine warmth to his wife, deferring to her judgment on matters of need, acknowledging her contributions to the relief effort with explicit gratitude. By the time evening descended, and the manor settled into the quieter rhythms of post-celebration, the servants were already engaged in the complex work of interpreting what they had witnessed. Change, in a great household, is recognized through 1,000 small indicators: the angle at which the Duke regarded his wife, the degree of formality retained in his address, the willingness or reluctance with which he touched her hand. And in each of these small details, the household read a narrative of transformation. It was Clara who sought out Evangeline in her sitting room near the hour of 9 o'clock, when much of the household had retired. She found the Duchess standing by the window overlooking the chapel garden, her hand resting upon the cold glass, her expression composed but illuminated from within by something that might have been cautious joy. The entire manner speaks of nothing else, Clara said without preamble, settling herself into the chair she had occupied so many times before. The Duke assisted in the distribution of gifts. He stood beside you. He permitted himself to be seen as pleased by your presence. The implications are not lost upon anyone capable of observation. Evangeline turned from the window, and Clara could see that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. But these, unlike so many tears of the previous 7 years, seemed to carry the weight of something other than resignation. "I scarcely dare to believe it," Evangeline admitted softly. 7 years of believing that distance was the natural state of our marriage, and in a single day, she paused, seeming to search for adequate words. "He has permitted me to see him. Truly see him, not the Duke, but the man beneath, the one who has been drowning in guilt whilst I stood beside him, unable to offer help because he had not permitted himself to acknowledge that help was needed." "And now?" Clara prompted gently. "Now," Evangeline replied, "we are beginning. It is terrifying, if I'm honest. I have spent 7 years learning to live without hope, and now hope has arrived with such suddenness that I scarcely know how to receive it. What if he returns to distance? What if tomorrow he wakes and remembers why he erected those walls, and decides that they are necessary after all?" Clara rose and moved to stand beside her friend at the window. The chapel garden below was transformed by moonlight, every surface edged with silver, the snow gleaming like accumulated starlight. "Some fears," Clara said, "are merely the echoes of old pain. They will persist for a time, but they will fade. What matters is not whether fear visits you, but whether you permit it to govern your actions. You have already proven through 7 years of faithful devotion that you are capable of love that endures through doubt. That same love will sustain you now, through the uncertainty of beginning again." The two women stood together in silence, watching the moonlit garden, while somewhere in the depths of the manor the household settled towards sleep, and the Duke lay awake in his study, unable to rest but no longer from guilt, rather from a strange, unfamiliar sensation that might have been hope. The days between Christmas and the New Year possessed a peculiar quality. Time seemed to move differently, suspended between the old season and the new, between the woman Evangeline had been and the woman she was becoming. The visiting relatives departed, their carriages departing through snow that had begun to melt beneath the weak but persistent winter sun. The manor, gradually emptied of its seasonal crowds, seemed to exhale with relief, revealing the spaces where transformation could occur without the constant surveillance of social scrutiny. It was on the penultimate day of the year that the Duke requested a private meeting with his wife in the library, a room they had scarcely occupied together since their marriage. The library was vast, lined with books accumulated over generations of ducal patronage, warmed by a substantial fire and lit by lamps that cast amber light across leather-bound spines and polished wood. Evangeline entered with the cautious grace that had become habitual over 7 years, uncertain still of what the Duke's summons might portend. But the moment she saw him, standing not behind his customary desk, but rather beside the fireplace, his posture less rigid than usual, she understood that this was not a convening of the formal sort. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who has spent considerable time in careful consideration, "about how to properly mark the beginning of our marriage. For 7 years we have been married in ceremony and in law, but we have not been married in truth. I would like to rectify that if you are willing." He moved toward her slowly, giving her opportunity to retreat if she wished, but Evangeline found herself moving forward instead, drawn toward him by something that transcended fear or caution. "I have written something," he continued, "not because I am skilled with words, that was always your gift expressed through your silence, but because I wish to articulate what has been circling my conscience since the morning I discovered you in the chapel. I would like to read it to you if you will permit me." He withdrew a letter from his waistcoat pocket, the paper folded with careful precision, and for a moment simply held it, gathering courage. Then, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, he began, "My dearest Evangeline, I have spent 7 years asking you to forgive my coldness, whilst never acknowledging what it was that necessitated such coldness. I have hidden behind the walls of the dukedom, behind the demands of estate and title, behind the accumulated guilt of a single moment of negligence that cost a child her life. But in doing so, I have committed a far greater wrong. I have asked you to love me whilst refusing to permit myself to be worthy of that love. You have taught me, through your example and your faithfulness, that love is not a reward to be earned through suffering, but a grace to be received with gratitude. You have shown me that forgiveness begins not with the sinner, but with the one who has been wronged, granting permission for transformation. And you have demonstrated that faith is not merely a matter of doctrine, but a lived practice, the daily choice to believe in possibility even when experience has given you cause to despair. I cannot undo 7 years. I cannot restore to you the warmth and companionship that was your right as a wife. But I can promise here before God and with you as witness that I will spend whatever years remain to us in the deliberate practice of becoming worthy of the love you have never withdrawn. I will be tender where I have been distant. I will speak where I have been silent, and I will permit myself finally to receive the grace that you have been offering me all along. With all that remains of my flawed but resolute heart, I am yours, entirely without reservation for as long as breath permits. Nicholas. When he finished reading, his voice had become hoarse and his eyes were wet with tears, tears that seemed to him a luxury he had not permitted himself in years. He looked at his wife, standing before him in the amber light, and waited for her response with the vulnerability of a man who has finally allowed his walls to crumble. Evangeline's composure, which had held through 7 years of silent suffering, finally gave way. Tears streamed down her face, not the quiet, controlled tears of resignation, but genuine sobs born of the release of accumulated longing. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 7 years of unspoken devotion made manifest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, my love. Yes, forever. Yes, to all of it." He drew her into his embrace, and they stood together in the firelit library. Two people who had finally learned that redemption is not something one earns through suffering, but something one receives through the grace of allowing oneself to be loved. 5 years later, on a winter morning remarkably similar to the one that had precipitated transformation, Evangeline stood once more in the chapel, but this time she was not alone. Beside her knelt her husband, and between them, held securely in the Duke's arms, was a child of 3 years, all dark curls and wide, curious eyes. The boy, named Eleanor in feminine form, but called Edward in daily life, possessed his father's serious expression, but his mother's capacity for gentle observation. The chapel had been transformed over those 5 years. Where it had once been cold and austere, it now gleamed with a particular kind of warmth born not of heated stone, but of habitual presence. The brass candle holder that had witnessed Evangeline's 7 years of solitary prayer had been joined by 3 others, and on this December morning, all 4 held flames that burned steadily, casting light that seemed almost golden in the dim space. The Duke's arm around his wife's shoulders was not the tentative touch of those first awkward weeks after his confession, but rather the easy possession of a man who had learned, through consistent practice, that tenderness was not weakness, but strength. 5 years of deliberate transformation had softened the harsh lines of his features, had brought back to his grey-blue eyes something of the warmth that had existed before guilt had calcified his heart. "Edward," Evangeline said softly to her son, pointing to the crucifix above the altar, "do you see? That is where Mama prayed, every morning before you were born. She prayed for your father and for a little girl named Eleanor who watches over you from heaven, and for the possibility that someday the world might remember that love is stronger than any walls we build to protect ourselves." The boy, with the practical curiosity of childhood, wriggled slightly in his father's arms. "Did Papa pray too?" he asked. The Duke exchanged a glance with his wife, and in that glance lived the history of their transformation, the years of distance, the chapel vigils, the moment of revelation, and the deliberate, painstaking work of learning to love openly. "Your father," he said carefully, "learned to pray much later than your mother. But when he finally came to this chapel, he discovered that he had many things for which to be grateful, and many apologies he wished to offer to heaven." He set the boy down carefully on the stone floor, holding his small hand securely. "Shall we light a candle together, Edward? One for Eleanor, and one for the people who will receive warmth this winter, because your mother taught us all about mercy?" The 3 of them moved together toward the candles, and Evangeline helped her son reach toward the flame with a long taper, guiding his small hand with infinite patience. When the new candle flared to life, Edward laughed, a sound of such pure delight that it seemed to ring off the chapel walls and transform the ancient space into something alive with hope. That evening, as the household settled toward sleep, and the manor grew quiet with the particular peace that comes from genuine contentment, the Duke found his wife sitting once more in the small sitting room where she had spent so many solitary hours. She was no longer surrounded by the weight of unspoken longing. Instead, She was engaged in the simple, profound work of mending one of Edward's shirts, the needle moving with rhythmic steadiness through the fabric. "I have something for you," the Duke said, offering a small velvet box that he drew from his pocket. "I have carried it for some time, waiting for the proper moment. I believe that moment has arrived." When Evangeline opened the box, she found not the elaborate jewelry of aristocratic display, but something far more intimate, a small pendant, crafted from silver in the shape of a candle flame. At the base, so tiny as to be almost invisible, were engraved 2 words, 7 years. "I commissioned this," the Duke explained, "to mark the distance between the woman you were when I was blind enough not to see you and the woman you have become, the woman I finally permitted myself to recognize. It is not an apology, though God knows I owe you apologies beyond number. It is rather an acknowledgement. 7 years of silence, and yet the light you maintained never once flickered or dimmed." He helped her fasten the pendant around her throat, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held the kind of peace that comes not from the absence of suffering, but from the transformation of that suffering into something meaningful, into purpose, into love, into the lived demonstration that grace is always possible for those brave enough to receive it. That night, as snow began to fall once more over the Ashford estate, transforming the gardens and rooftops into scenes of terrible beauty, the Duke and Duchess slept beside each other, not in the formal arrangement of conjugal duty, but in the intimate closeness of 2 souls who had finally learned that love was not something to be feared or rationed, but something to be received with open hands and grateful hearts. In the chapel below, 4 candles burned steadily, their flames reflecting off polished brass and ancient stone, light persisting in the darkness, witness to a love that had learned to endure through suffering and emerged transformed into something stronger, more true, more profoundly human than either of them had believed possible. And somewhere in the space beyond the visible world, the ghost of a small girl named Eleanor Ashford, whose death had nearly destroyed the man who bore her name, seemed finally to rest, knowing that her brief life had become the catalyst for grace, and that her memory was honored not through endless guilt, but through the deliberate choice of her father to become better, kinder, and more worthy of the love that waited for him all along. A reflection on love, grace, and the redemptive power of faith. In a world that teaches us to measure love by demonstrable acts, by passionate declaration, by the visible proof of reciprocal affection, Evangeline's story stands as a quiet revolution. She loved in silence. She loved without reward. She loved a man who had built walls so high and so formidable that her love could scarcely penetrate them, and yet she did not withdraw that love, did not demand recognition, did not permit bitterness to calcify her heart as it had his. The true moral of this story is not that patience is rewarded, though in this narrative it eventually is. Rather, it is that love does not exist for the purpose of being returned. Love exists because the human heart is capable of extraordinary grace, and that grace is not diminished by being offered to those who are incapable, in the moment, of receiving it. We are taught that love is transactional, that we love in order to be loved, that we give affection in hopes of receiving affection in return. But Evangeline's 7 years of faithful devotion, her prayers whispered in cold chapels, her quiet service and her refusal to permit herself to become embittered, these were not acts of calculation. They were acts of faith, faith that redemption is possible, faith that grace exists not as something we earn, but as something we practice, and in practicing it, we become capable of receiving it. The Duke's transformation does not come because Evangeline demanded change. It comes because he finally witnessed in the mirror of her faithfulness what he himself was capable of becoming. We often assume that love must be passionate, demonstrative, demanding to be seen and celebrated, but sometimes the most transformative love is the love that remains quiet, persistent, faithful, the love that says, "I see your suffering, and I will not abandon you because of it. I will stand beside you until you are ready to let it go." This is the moral that we must carry from this story, that love is not measured by the ease with which it is expressed, but by the commitment with which it is maintained. That grace is available to all of us, if we are willing to accept it, not as a reward for suffering, but as a gift offered freely by those who love us enough to see past our walls and believe in the possibility of our redemption. Dear beloved listeners, we invite you to join our growing community of souls who have discovered that Victorian romance is far more than a matter of drawing rooms and formal propriety. It is a mirror in which we see reflected the deepest longings of the human heart. If this story has moved you, we urge you to Subscribe to our channel so that you never miss a new story, and allow the voices of the Victorian era to accompany you through your own seasons of waiting, hoping, and discovering that love is stronger than the walls we build to protect ourselves. Leave a comment below and share with us what moment from Evangeline and Nicholas's journey spoke most profoundly to your own experience. Have you ever loved silently, faithfully, believing that your devotion might go unrecognized? Or have you, like the Duke, discovered that grace arrives not as punishment for our failures, but as an opportunity to become worthy of the love that has been waiting for us all along? Share this story with someone in your life who needs to remember that faith persists, that love endures, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to receive it. Your voices matter. Your stories matter. Your willingness to engage with these narratives of love and grace strengthens our entire community. So we ask you, with gratitude and genuine hope, join us in this space where Victorian romance continues to teach us about the deepest truths of the human heart. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we wish to extend our deepest gratitude to you for dedicating nearly 90 minutes of your precious time to Evangeline and Nicholas's journey. In a world that often moves too quickly, that privileges visible action over quiet faithfulness, that celebrates passion but neglects persistence, we believe that stories such as these serve a vital purpose. Thank you for entering the chapel with Evangeline as she whispered her prayers. Thank you for standing with the Duke as he finally allowed his walls to crumble. Thank you for believing, along with us, that love in its most redemptive form is often the love that asks for nothing and yet transforms everything. We are deeply grateful for your presence, your engagement, and your willingness to allow the Victorian era to speak to the particular longings of your contemporary heart. It is because of listeners like you that we continue to craft these stories with meticulous care, with reverence for the emotional complexities that define the human experience, and with the firm belief that love, true, faithful, transformative love, is always worth the waiting. Until our next tale of love, grace, and the quiet miracles that transpire when hearts finally learn to open, we remain, with profound appreciation and endless respect, your devoted storytellers at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, where passion meets propriety and love discovers its truest form.